Sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us deepest. Every family carries wounds that never quite heal, passed down like heirlooms from one generation to the next. In the winter of 1889, Margaret and her grown daughter Amelia lived alone in their Montana homestead. Years of harsh frontier life had made Margaret tough and controlling. Amelia felt trapped under her mother's strict rules. The tension between them grew stronger each day. When Daniel, a quiet mountain man, arrived seeking shelter from the bitter cold, everything changed. What started as a simple act of hospitality turned into something much bigger. Amelia's anger finally exploded in front of this stranger. She dumped a bucket of cold water right over her mother's head. But what Daniel did next shocked everyone. What secret was this mountain man hiding that would change both women forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cracked daguerreotype sat on the mantelpiece like a silent witness to better times. In the faded image, a young woman with gentle eyes stood beside a tall man in his Sunday best, their hands clasped with the awkward formality of new love. That woman had been Margaret Whitmore, 22 years old and full of dreams about building a life in the Montana Territory. The woman who lived in this cabin now bore little resemblance to that hopeful bride. Margaret Whitmore had arrived in Silver Creek Valley in the spring of 1866, her trunk filled with embroidered linens and her head filled with romantic notions about frontier life. She'd married Samuel Whitmore after a courtship conducted entirely through letters, trusting in his promises of fertile land and a comfortable home. What she'd found instead was a one-room cabin, a struggling claim, and the harsh reality that survival demanded every ounce of strength she possessed. The first winter nearly broke her. Samuel worked from dawn to dusk, clearing trees and breaking ground, leaving Margaret alone for days at a time, with nothing but the wind for company. She'd sit by the single window, her fine needlework forgotten, watching snow pile against the glass, and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The isolation pressed against her chest like a physical weight, making it hard to breathe. But spring had come, as it always did, and with it came Amelia. Margaret had labored for 18 hours in that tiny cabin, with only the midwife from the neighboring homestead to help her. When she finally held her daughter, all the loneliness and fear seemed worth it. This child would have the strength she sometimes lacked. This child would thrive where she had merely survived. Samuel had loved Amelia with the fierce devotion of a man who'd waited 35 years to become a father. He carved toys for her from scraps of wood, told her stories about the mountains, and promised her adventures beyond the confines of their small world. When he died in Amelia's 8th year, thrown from a spooked horse during a sudden thunderstorm, his absence left a hole that neither woman knew how to fill. That was when Margaret's transformation truly began. Without Samuel's steady presence, she felt the full weight of responsibility for their survival. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away. The town of Silver Creek was a 2-day ride in good weather. If something happened, if Amelia fell ill, if the roof caved in, if wolves came too close to the cabin, Margaret would face it alone. She taught herself to think like Samuel. Every decision had to serve survival first. Sentiment was a luxury they couldn't afford. When Amelia wanted to keep the runt piglet as a pet, Margaret slaughtered it for winter meat. When Amelia begged to attend the traveling preacher's revival in town, Margaret said no. The time away from chores could mean they'd fall behind on preparations for winter. When Amelia asked why they couldn't move closer to other families, Margaret explained that their land was all they had, and losing it would mean destitution. Each choice hardened something inside Margaret. She watched her daughter's disappointment and told herself it was necessary. Better for Amelia to learn early that life demanded difficult decisions. Better for her to understand that survival came before happiness, duty before desire. Amelia had been 8 when her father died, old enough to remember his gentleness but young enough to adapt to her mother's stricter ways. For years, she'd accepted Margaret's authority without question. She'd learned to tend the garden, preserve food for winter, mend clothes, and handle a rifle. She could track wounded game, birth a calf, and calculate how much firewood they'd need to last until spring. But as Amelia grew into womanhood, the questions began. Why couldn't they hire help during harvest? Why couldn't they take the train east to visit Margaret's sister, who wrote letters begging them to come? Why couldn't they at least spend Christmas with the Hendersons, who lived over the ridge and had always been kind? Margaret's answers became shorter, her rules more rigid. The cabin that had once felt cozy began to feel like a prison to Amelia. At 23, she was intelligent, capable, and increasingly restless. She'd read every book they owned dozens of times. She knew every tree, rock, and stream within walking distance. She dreamed of conversations with people her own age, of dances and church socials, and the simple pleasure of new faces. The daily routines that gave Margaret comfort felt like chains to Amelia. Every morning, they rose before dawn to tend the animals. Every afternoon, they worked side by side in the garden or preserving food or mending equipment. Every evening, they sat by the fire, Margaret reading her worn Bible while Amelia darned socks or pieced quilts. The silence between them had grown heavier with each passing season. Margaret noticed her daughter's restlessness, but interpreted it as ingratitude. Didn't Amelia understand how much they'd sacrificed to keep this land? Didn't she appreciate the security they'd built through hard work and careful planning? When Amelia suggested they might visit town more often, Margaret saw it as frivolous thinking. When Amelia wondered aloud about marriage and children of her own, Margaret pointed out that no decent man would want to court a woman so far from civilization. These conversations always ended the same way, with Amelia falling silent and Margaret feeling like she'd said something wrong, but not knowing what. The gap between them widened like a crack in ice, too thin to see clearly, but deep enough to threaten everything built upon it. The winter of 1889 had been particularly harsh. Snow had fallen early and deep, trapping them in the cabin for weeks at a time. Their conversations had dwindled to practical necessities. More wood for the fire. The beans are running low. I heard wolves near the chicken coop last night. The silence between these exchanges stretched longer each day. It was during one of these endless February afternoons that they'd heard the knock on their door. Both women had frozen at the sound. Visitors were rare in good weather and nearly impossible during winter storms. Margaret had reached for the rifle, while Amelia peered through the frosted window. The man standing on their porch was tall and broad-shouldered, with a graying beard and the weathered face of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. Snow clung to his heavy coat and wide-brimmed hat. His horse stood nearby, head drooping with exhaustion. He looked like a dozen other mountain men they'd encountered over the years, rough, practical, and probably harmless if treated with reasonable caution. "Good afternoon, ladies," he'd called through the door, his voice carrying the slight rasp of someone who didn't speak often. "Name's Daniel Hartwell. I don't mean any trouble, but I've been riding for 3 days straight, and my horse isn't going to make it much further. I'm hoping you might spare some shelter for the night." Margaret had hesitated. Their policy had always been to help travelers. When possible, it was frontier custom and simple human decency. But something about this stranger made her cautious. Maybe it was the way he stood perfectly still despite the cold, or how his eyes seemed to take in every detail of their surroundings. He had the patient watchfulness of a man accustomed to danger. "You can stable your horse in the barn," she'd finally called back. "There's hay in the loft. We'll have supper ready in an hour." And so Daniel Hartwell had entered their lives, carrying with him the worn leather Bible tucked deep in his saddlebags and the secrets that would soon turn their quiet world upside down. Neither Margaret nor Amelia could have predicted that this tired stranger seeking shelter would become the catalyst for everything that followed. That night, as Margaret ladled stew into 3 bowls and Amelia set the table with their best dishes, neither woman spoke of the subtle tension crackling between them. But Daniel noticed it immediately, the way they moved around each other with careful precision, like dancers who'd forgotten how to hear the music. He saw Amelia's quick glances toward the door, as if measuring the distance to freedom. He saw Margaret's rigid posture, the way she held herself like a soldier at attention even in her own home. During dinner, he'd made polite conversation about the weather and the trails, but his real attention was focused on the unspoken words hanging heavy in the cabin's warm air. These two women were drowning in their own silence, and Daniel Hartwell, who understood something about the weight of unspoken truths, recognized the signs of a family about to break apart. Daniel's worn leather Bible lay open on the small table beside his bedroll, its pages yellowed with age and marked by countless readings. Between the pages of Psalms, pressed flat as autumn leaves, were tiny wildflowers, mountain laurel, Indian paintbrush, and wild roses. Each bloom carried a memory, and in the margin next to the 23rd Psalm, written in fading ink, was a woman's name, Sarah. The Bible had traveled with Daniel for 15 years, a constant reminder of love lost and faith tested. The morning after Daniel's arrival dawned clear and bitterly cold. Margaret rose before sunrise, as she always did, moving quietly through her routines while their guests slept on the makeshift bed they'd arranged near the fireplace. She'd barely slept herself, hyper-aware of the stranger's presence in their small space. Not from fear, Daniel had been nothing but courteous, but from the simple strangeness of having someone new witness their daily patterns. Amelia appeared in the kitchen as Margaret started breakfast, her long brown hair braided hastily and her dress wrinkled from restless sleep. She moved to the water bucket without speaking, preparing to wash her face, but stopped when she saw it was nearly empty. "I'll get more water from the well," Amelia murmured, reaching for her heavy coat. "No need," Margaret replied, not looking up from the bacon she was frying. "There's enough for washing. We'll melt snow for cooking. The well water tastes better for coffee. Our guest will make do with what we have." Margaret's tone carried the finality that had ended countless similar exchanges over the years. But this morning felt different to Amelia. Maybe it was Daniel's presence, or maybe it was simply that she'd reached the end of her patience with being managed like a child. She pulled on her coat anyway. "I said no, Amelia." Margaret's voice sharpened. "The path to the well is icy, and there's no point risking a fall for fresh water when we have what we need. I'm 23 years old, Mother. I think I can manage walking to our own well." Margaret turned from the stove, her face flushing with the familiar anger that came whenever Amelia questioned her decisions. "You'll stay inside. That's final." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Amelia felt something snap inside her chest, years of accumulated resentment, suddenly finding focus in this trivial disagreement about water. She glanced toward Daniel, still sleeping peacefully by the fire, and felt a surge of embarrassment at having this stranger witness their dysfunctional dance. "Why?" The question came out sharper than Amelia intended. "Why is it always, 'That's final' with you? Why can't I make any decisions about my own life?" "Because your decisions affect both of us," Margaret replied, her voice rising despite her awareness of their sleeping guest. "Because someone has to think practically in this family." "Practically," Amelia laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is it practical to keep me locked up here like a prisoner? Is it practical to refuse every invitation, turn down every opportunity, say no to everything that might bring us joy?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "Joy doesn't keep us fed through winter. And what good is being fed if we're too miserable to enjoy it?" Daniel stirred on his bedroll, awakened by their raised voices. Both women noticed, but neither stopped. The argument had taken on a momentum of its own. "Miserable?" Margaret's voice cracked slightly. "Everything I've done has been to protect you, to ensure our survival. If that makes me a terrible mother, it makes you afraid," Amelia shot back. "You're so terrified of losing what we have that you won't let us actually live." Margaret stared at her daughter, wounded and furious in equal measure. "How dare you speak to me that way? After everything I've sacrificed." "Sacrificed? Or hidden?" Amelia grabbed the water bucket from the counter. When did caring for me become an excuse for controlling every breath I take? Put that bucket down. No. The single word fell between them like a stone into still water. Margaret stepped forward, her face pale with anger. I am your mother, and you will obey me in my own house. Your house? Amelia's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more force than shouting. When did it stop being our home? Margaret reached for the bucket, and Amelia jerked it away. The sudden movement sent water sloshing over the rim, spattering both women. For a moment, they stood frozen, staring at each other across a chasm that had opened in their small kitchen. Then Amelia lifted the bucket and deliberately, slowly, poured the entire contents over her mother's head. The water was shockingly cold. Margaret gasped as it soaked through her hair and dress, running down her face and puddling on the floor around her feet. She stood there dripping, her mouth open in stunned disbelief, looking smaller somehow in her wet clothes. Daniel had risen silently from his bedroll and now stood watching this family drama unfold. Amelia turned to him, her face flushed with defiance and immediate regret. There, she said, her voice shaking. Now you've seen what kind of family takes you in. A mother who treats her grown daughter like a wayward child, and a daughter who... Her voice broke. Margaret hadn't moved. She stood in the puddle of water, shivering, her dignity as soaked as her dress, tears mixed with the well water on her cheeks. Daniel stepped forward, and both women tensed, unsure what judgment this stranger might pass. Instead, he walked calmly to the linen closet, pulled out a thick towel, and handed it to Margaret. My own mother threw a pitcher of buttermilk at my father once, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of old memory. I was about 12. They'd been fighting about whether to sell the farm and move to town. She was tired of the isolation. Wanted our family to have neighbors and church socials. He was determined to keep the land his father had left him. Margaret took the towel but didn't use it, still staring at Daniel in confusion. What happened? Amelia whispered. Daniel smiled sadly. My father stood there, dripping buttermilk, just like your mother is now. And you know what he did? He started laughing. Not mean laughter, gentle laughter, like he'd suddenly understood something important. He said, Sarah, I reckon if you're willing to waste good buttermilk to make your point, maybe I ought to listen harder. He picked up another towel and began wiping water from the floor. They talked for 3 hours after that. Really talked, maybe for the first time in years. They didn't solve everything that day, but they started understanding each other. Margaret finally pressed the towel to her face, hiding behind it. And did they move to town? She asked, her voice muffled. They found a middle ground, kept the farm but built a house closer to the main road, started hosting church meetings once a month. My mother got her community, my father kept his land, and our family learned that sometimes you have to make a mess before you can clean things up properly. Amelia sank into a chair, the fight gone out of her as quickly as it had come. I'm sorry, Mother. I don't know why I... Because you're drowning, Daniel said gently. Both of you. You're drowning in silence and stubbornness and fear of saying the wrong thing. Sometimes drowning people lash out at the very people trying to save them. Margaret lowered the towel, her hair hanging in wet tangles around her face. She looked younger somehow, vulnerable in a way Amelia hadn't seen since childhood. I don't know how to do this anymore, Margaret admitted, her voice barely audible. I don't know how to be her mother without being her jailer. I don't know how to keep her safe without keeping her trapped. Daniel knelt to finish, cleaning the water from the floor. Maybe that's a conversation worth having, he suggested. Maybe it's time to figure out what safety really means and what freedom costs, and whether you can have both. As he spoke, neither woman noticed the way his hands moved with practiced efficiency, or how his eyes constantly scanned the windows and door. They didn't see the small, unconscious adjustments he made to his position, always keeping himself between them and any potential threat. Daniel Hartwell had skills that went far beyond dispensing family wisdom, and secrets that ran much deeper than a pressed flower in an old Bible. But for now, he was simply a kind stranger helping two women clean up more than just spilled water. The broken music box sat on Amelia's dresser like a monument to lost innocence. Its pink porcelain ballerina, once graceful and spinning, now stood frozen at an awkward angle, her tiny painted smile cracked down the middle. The melody it had once played, a sweet waltz that had lulled young Amelia to sleep, was trapped forever inside its broken mechanism. Samuel had brought it back from a trip to Helena when Amelia was 6, trading 2 days' worth of pelts for the delicate treasure. Every little girl should have music in her life, he'd told Margaret, winding the tiny key and watching their daughter's face light up with wonder. Margaret had changed into dry clothes, braiding her still damp hair with fingers that trembled slightly from cold and emotion. She moved through her morning routines with mechanical precision, but Amelia noticed the small differences, how her mother's shoulders remained tense, how she avoided meeting anyone's eyes, how she stirred the coffee with unnecessary force. Daniel had insisted on stepping outside to tend his horse, giving the women space to process what had happened. Through the kitchen window, Amelia watched him brush down the animal with the patient thoroughness of a man who understood that caring for one's mount might mean the difference between life and death. There was something reassuring about his steady movements, the way he spoke quietly to the horse while checking its hooves and adjusting its blanket. "Mother," Amelia began, then stopped. The words she needed felt clumsy in her mouth, too small for the weight of years of miscommunication. Margaret continued stirring her coffee, the spoon clicking against the cup in a nervous rhythm. "Your father gave you that music box for your 6th birthday, she said suddenly, nodding toward Amelia's room. "You carried it everywhere for months. You'd wind it up and dance along with the ballerina." Amelia glanced toward her bedroom door, surprised her mother had noticed the broken treasure still sitting on her dresser. "I remember. You said it was too delicate for everyday play, but Papa told you music was meant to be enjoyed, not preserved. He was right about many things." Margaret's voice carried a weariness that went deeper than the morning's conflict. "He had a gift for seeing joy in simple moments. I envied that about him." "You could have that gift too," Amelia said carefully. "It doesn't have to die with him." Margaret finally looked up, her eyes red-rimmed but clear. "When he died, I felt like that music box, something essential broke inside me, and I didn't know how to fix it. So I just stopped trying to make music." The admission hung between them, more intimate than any conversation they'd shared in years. Amelia sat down across from her mother, close enough to see the fine lines around Margaret's eyes, the grey threading through her brown hair, the small scars on her hands from countless cuts and burns accumulated through years of frontier survival. "I've been angry for so long," Amelia whispered. "But I think I've been angry at the wrong things. I blamed you for keeping me here, but maybe I was really angry at Papa for leaving us." Margaret's coffee cup rattled against the saucer as she set it down. "He didn't choose to leave. I know, but knowing it and feeling it are different things." Amelia reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of her mother's hand. "And maybe I've been angry at myself for not being brave enough to say what I really wanted." "What do you really want?" The question was spoken so quietly Amelia almost missed it. When she looked up, she saw something in her mother's face she hadn't seen in years, genuine curiosity, as if Margaret was truly willing to hear the answer, whatever it might be. "I want to know you," Amelia said. "Not just the woman who tells me what to do, but the woman who danced to my music box with Papa. I want to hear your stories, your dreams, your fears. I want to know what you think about when you stare out the window during those long winter afternoons." Margaret's breath caught. "And what else? I want to have choices. Not about big things necessarily, but small ones. Whether to fetch water from the well or melt snow, whether to wear the blue dress or the brown one, whether to sit by the fire or on the porch." Amelia paused, gathering courage. "I want to make mistakes and learn from them instead of being protected from every possible error." Outside, they could hear Daniel moving around the barn, the sound of hay being forked down from the loft. The normal sounds of morning chores, but somehow different with this stranger's presence altering their familiar rhythms. I was 17 when I married your father, Margaret said suddenly. 17, and certain I knew everything about love and life and happiness. My own mother tried to warn me about the hardships of frontier living, but I thought she was just being pessimistic. She laughed, but it came out hollow. I was so eager to prove I could handle anything. Were you happy at first? Blissfully. Those first months felt like an adventure. Every challenge was exciting. Every small success felt like a victory. Margaret stared into her coffee, as if reading the past in its dark surface. But when winter came, and I realized how truly isolated we were, how completely dependent on Samuel's strength and knowledge, it frightened me. What if something happened to him? What if I made a mistake that cost us our lives? Amelia had never heard this part of her parents' story. She'd always imagined her mother arriving as a fully formed frontier woman, stern and capable from the beginning. When you were born, Margaret continued, that fear multiplied by 1,000. Suddenly, I wasn't just responsible for my own survival, but for this tiny, helpless person who depended on me for everything. When Samuel died, her voice trailed off. You felt like you had to become him. Amelia finished. Strong enough for both of us. I felt like if I showed any weakness, any uncertainty, we'd both be lost. So I made myself into someone who always knew what to do, even when I didn't, especially when I didn't. The kitchen door opened, bringing a blast of cold air and Daniel's quiet presence. He stamped his boots on the threshold, brushing snow from his coat. Storm's building again, he announced. Sky's got that heavy look. We'll likely be snowed in for another day or two. Both women felt the implications of this news settle over them. Another day of forced proximity, another day of navigating this new dynamic they'd barely begun to understand. Daniel hung his coat on the peg by the door and approached the stove to warm his hands. Mind if I ask about that music box in your room, miss? I noticed it through the doorway. Looks like fine craftsmanship. Amelia glanced at her mother, surprised by the question. My father brought it from Helena when I was small. It used to play a waltz, but the mechanism broke years ago. Might be fixable, Daniel said casually. I've had some experience with delicate mechanisms. Sometimes what looks broken just needs the right touch to make music again. The words seemed to carry more weight than a simple offer to repair a toy. Margaret and Amelia exchanged a look, the first truly connected moment they'd shared since the water incident. I'd like that, Amelia said. I'd forgotten how much I missed the music. Outside, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, sealing them together in their small cabin. But instead of feeling trapped, both women found themselves curious about what the next day might bring. The small wooden horse Daniel carved from a piece of firewood was no larger than his palm, but every detail spoke of patient love. Its mane flowed in delicate waves, its legs were positioned mid-gallop, and its eyes held an expression of wild joy. As his knife shaped the final touches, memories surfaced like ghosts. Another wooden horse, carved for different hands, for a child who would never grow up to ride real ones. Daniel had claimed a corner near the window, where the light was best for his work. The storm Margaret had predicted arrived with full fury by midday, sealing them inside with walls of driving snow. Rather than feeling trapped, however, the cabin had taken on an unexpectedly peaceful atmosphere. Margaret worked at her mending, Amelia prepared vegetables for stew, and Daniel's knife whispered against wood in a rhythm that somehow soothed them all. You have steady hands, Margaret observed, glancing up from the sock she was darning. That's skilled work. Daniel paused in his carving, holding the horse up to examine its proportions. My father taught me, said a man should know how to make something beautiful with his hands, not just useful things. He resumed his careful shaping of the horse's ears. Of course, he was talking about furniture and farm tools, but the principle holds. Did you have children to carve for? Amelia asked, then immediately colored at her own boldness. I'm sorry, that's too personal. No harm in asking. Daniel's voice remained steady, but his hands stilled on the carving. I had had a son once, would have been about 7 now. He set down his knife and really looked at the wooden horse for the first time. Timothy, bright as a new penny and fearless as they come. Margaret's needle stopped moving through the wool. The weight of would have been, and had, hung heavy in the warm air. Fever took him and his mother 3 winters back, Daniel continued, his voice matter-of-fact, but his eyes distant. Been moving around ever since. Seems like staying in one place too long just makes the quiet louder. Amelia felt her earlier resentments about isolation shrink in the face of this man's real loss. I'm sorry. I can't imagine. Each person carries their own load, Daniel said gently. Yours isn't lighter because mine feels heavier. Pain's not a competition. He picked up his knife again, making a tiny adjustment to the horse's nose. But I've learned that sharing the load makes it easier to bear, even when you can't set it down completely. Margaret had been listening while continuing her mending, but now she set aside her work entirely. When Samuel died, I thought sharing my grief would make me seem weak. Like admitting I couldn't handle things alone would prove I wasn't fit to raise Amelia properly. So you carried it all by yourself, Daniel observed, for 15 years. Margaret's voice cracked slightly. 15 years of pretending I was strong enough, wise enough, certain enough to make every decision correctly. Amelia reached for her mother's hand, this time completing the gesture she'd stopped short of that morning. Margaret's fingers were rough from work but warm, and they closed gratefully around her daughter's. You were strong enough, Amelia said. Look around us. We survived every winter, every crisis, every hardship. The problem wasn't your strength, it was thinking you had to use it alone. Daniel held up the completed horse, studying it in the firelight. My Sarah used to say that strength isn't about never needing help. It's about knowing when to ask for it and being willing to give it when others need it. Sarah was your wife? Margaret asked. Sarah was everything good in my world. Daniel's thumb traced the wooden horse's mane. She had a way of seeing the best in every situation, every person, even me, on my darker days. He looked up at both women. She would have liked you both. Would have said you just needed someone to remind you how to listen to each other. Outside, the wind howled around the cabin's corners, but inside, the storm seemed to be bringing them closer together rather than driving them apart. Amelia found herself studying Daniel's face, noting the lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and sorrow, the careful way he moved his hands, the unconscious alertness that never quite left him, even in these peaceful moments. May I ask you something personal? She said. Daniel nodded, setting the wooden horse on the table between them. You carry yourself like a man who's seen trouble, real trouble, not just the everyday hardships of frontier life. And you have a way of watching everything, like you're always expecting something to happen. Margaret looked sharply at her daughter, surprised by this observation, then back at Daniel with new interest. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. I've seen my share of trouble, that's true. Some looking for it, some having it find me whether I wanted it or not. He met Amelia's gaze directly. But right now, in this place, I'm just a man grateful for shelter and good company. Sometimes that's enough. It was an answer that revealed nothing while acknowledging everything. Amelia sensed there were depths to Daniel's story they hadn't even glimpsed, but she also sensed he wasn't ready to share them. Perhaps he was still deciding whether he could trust them with whatever secrets he carried. The horse is beautiful, Margaret said, changing the subject with the instinct of someone who understood the value of privacy. Will you keep it? Daniel picked up the carving again, turning it over in his weathered hands. I thought I might give it to someone who'd appreciate it. Someone who understands about broken things being made whole again. His eyes flickered to Amelia's bedroom door, where the broken music box waited in silent testimony to interrupted joy. I'd be honored, Amelia said softly, but only if you'll let me try to fix something for you in return. What did you have in mind? Amelia gestured toward the mending basket, the neatly organized kitchen, the comfortable warmth of their small home. "You've been carrying your grief alone, just like we've been carrying our anger alone. Maybe we could all try carrying our burdens together for a while. See if Daniel Sarah was right about sharing the load." Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand. "I'd like that. I'm tired of being strong enough for everyone all the time." Daniel smiled, the first truly peaceful expression they'd seen from him. Sarah would have been proud of that wisdom, and she always did love a good snowstorm for bringing people together. As if summoned by his words, the wind outside rose to a keening wail, piling snow higher against their windows. But none of them minded being trapped now. They were beginning to understand that sometimes the best conversations happen when there's nowhere else to go and nothing else to do but finally listen to each other. The faded letter from Margaret's sister arrived with the mail carrier 3 days after the storm cleared, carried in a leather pouch that had traveled 2,000 miles from Boston. The envelope bore elegant script that spoke of comfortable parlors and gaslighting, of a world where women wore silk gloves and worried about the proper arrangement of calling cards rather than whether they had enough firewood to last until spring. Inside, Eleanor's familiar handwriting painted pictures of tree-lined streets, theatre performances, and a warm bedroom, waiting for Margaret in a proper house with proper neighbours. Margaret held the letter with trembling fingers, reading it for the 3rd time, while Daniel repaired a loose board on the porch and Amelia tended the chickens. The words seemed to glow with possibility and torment in equal measure. "Dearest Margaret," the letter began, "I write to you again with hope that this time you might seriously consider my invitation. Robert's business continues to prosper, and we have more than enough room in our home for both you and Amelia. The city has changed so much since you left. Electric lights now illuminate the main streets, and there are opportunities for young women that simply didn't exist in our mother's time. Amelia could attend the teacher's college or learn typing and bookkeeping. She could meet suitable young men from good families, attend concerts and lectures." Margaret paused at this section, imagining Amelia in a bustling classroom, surrounded by books and other eager minds. The image was both wonderful and terrifying. "I know you feel obligated to maintain Samuel's homestead," Eleanor continued, "but dear sister, you've proven yourself 100 times over. You've honored his memory through 15 years of hardship. Surely he would want you and Amelia to have lives filled with more than mere survival. We are not getting any younger, Margaret. I fear, if you wait much longer, the transition will become impossible." The letter went on to describe the comforts waiting for them, regular meals prepared by a cook, hot baths drawn by servants, warm clothes purchased from proper shops rather than sewn by lamplight from carefully hoarded fabric. It painted a picture of ease that seemed like fantasy after so many years of frontier hardship. But it was the final paragraph that struck deepest. "I received your last letter 3 months ago, and I sensed an exhaustion in your words that frightens me. You write of duty and responsibility, but never of joy or hope. Please, Margaret, consider that there might be more to life than simply enduring it." When Amelia came in from the chicken coop, she found her mother sitting motionless at the kitchen table. The letter spread before her like a map to another world. "Bad news?" Amelia asked, hanging up her coat and noting the pallor in Margaret's cheeks. "An invitation." Margaret's voice sounded strange, as if the words belonged to someone else. "From your Aunt Eleanor. She wants us to come live with her family in Boston." Amelia's hands stilled on the coat pegs. She'd heard stories about Eleanor her entire life, the sister who'd married well and moved east, who sent Christmas packages filled with impossible luxuries like store-bought candy and books with gilt edges. Eleanor had always seemed like a character from a fairy tale, too distant and grand to be real. "What kind of invitation?" Margaret held out the letter, watching Amelia's face as she read. She saw her daughter's eyes widen at the descriptions of electric lights and college opportunities, saw the way her breathing quickened at the mention of concerts and lectures and suitable young men. "She's offering us a different life," Margaret said quietly. "An easier life." Amelia finished reading and set the letter down carefully, as if it might shatter. "What do you think?" "I think I'm terrified," Margaret admitted. "Terrified of leaving everything we've built here, and terrified of staying and watching you waste away from loneliness and boredom." Daniel's footsteps sounded on the porch, followed by the scrape of his boots on the threshold. He entered to find both women staring at the letter as if it were a snake that might strike at any moment. "Forgive me," he said, noting the tension immediately. "I can take my coffee outside if you need privacy." "No, please stay." Margaret gestured to his usual chair. "We could use your perspective. Amelia's aunt has invited us to leave Montana and live with her family in Boston." Daniel poured himself coffee and sat down, his eyes moving from the letter to the women's faces. "That's quite an offer. What's holding you back?" "Everything," Margaret said with a short laugh. "This land, this cabin, it's all we have. Samuel worked himself to death to build something here. Leaving feels like betraying his memory, and staying feels like betraying your daughter's future," Daniel observed gently. Margaret's coffee cup rattled against the saucer. "How did you? It's written all over both your faces. You're torn between honoring the past and embracing the future." Daniel looked at Amelia. "And you're feeling guilty for wanting things your father never got to see, opportunities your mother never had." Amelia nodded miserably. "I keep thinking about electric lights and libraries and meeting other young women. But then I look around this cabin and remember Papa building these shelves, carving that doorframe. How can I want to leave the only home I've ever known?" "Maybe," Daniel said thoughtfully, "the question isn't whether to stay or go, but what staying or going would mean for each of you." Margaret frowned. "I don't understand. What would staying mean for you, Margaret? Really staying, not just enduring?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose it would mean finding a way to be happy here. To see this place as more than just a burden to be borne. To remember why Samuel loved this land enough to die for it. And what would leaving mean? Starting over at 42 years old, learning to live in a world I left behind 23 years ago, depending on Eleanor's charity instead of my own strength." Margaret's voice dropped. "Being the poor relation who couldn't make it on her own." Daniel turned to Amelia. "And for you? What would staying mean? Growing old in this cabin, never knowing what else might be possible, watching other people's children in town and wondering if I'll ever have my own. Reading the same books over and over until I know them by heart." Amelia's voice grew stronger. "But it would also mean staying close to Papa's memory, keeping the home he built, carrying on his work. And leaving? Adventure. Education. Choices I've never imagined." Amelia looked at her mother. "But it would also mean leaving you to manage everything alone, or forcing you to give up the life you fought so hard to build." Daniel sipped his coffee, letting their words settle in the warm air. "You know what I think Samuel would say if he were here?" Both women leaned forward slightly. "I think he'd say that he didn't work himself to death for a piece of land. He worked himself to death for the two people he loved most in the world. And if those people would be happier, safer, or more fulfilled somewhere else, then the land was just a means to an end, not the end itself." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "But what if we're not strong enough for city life? What if we fail?" "What if you succeed?" Daniel countered. "What if Amelia becomes the teacher she's always dreamed of being? What if you discover talents you never knew you had? What if this invitation isn't an end to your story, but the beginning of a new chapter?" The letter lay between them, no longer seeming quite so much like a threat. Outside, the Montana wind whistled through the pines, singing the ancient song of wilderness and solitude. But inside the cabin, three people sat contemplating the possibility that sometimes the bravest thing isn't holding on, it's knowing when to let go. Margaret's hidden diary lay beneath a loose floorboard under her bed, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with a faded blue ribbon. For 15 years, she'd poured her deepest thoughts onto those pages during the long hours when Amelia slept, and the cabin fell silent around her. The leather-bound book contained her fears about raising a daughter alone, her guilt over harsh words, spoken in moments of desperation, her dreams about the woman Amelia might become, and her terror that her own limitations might somehow damage the bright spirit she'd been entrusted to nurture. Amelia discovered the diary by accident while helping her mother reorganize the bedroom. A section of floorboard had warped during the recent storms, creating a gap that caught her attention when she moved the washstand to clean beneath it. Curious, she pried up the loose board and found the wrapped bundle hidden in the space below. She knew immediately what it was. Every frontier woman kept some record of her thoughts, letters never sent, observations about weather and crops, prayers written when speaking them aloud felt insufficient. But Margaret had always been so private about her inner world that Amelia had assumed she kept no such record. The blue ribbon came away easily, and the diary fell open to a page dated just 3 months earlier. I watched Amelia today as she stood at the kitchen window, looking toward the road that leads to town. There was such longing in her face, such hunger for something beyond these 4 walls. I wanted to ask her what she was thinking, what she was hoping for, but I was afraid of the answer. What if she told me she dreams of leaving? What if she said she feels trapped here with me? I think it would break my heart to know that my love has become her prison. Amelia's breath caught. She should have closed the diary immediately, should have rewrapped it and returned it to its hiding place. Instead, she found herself turning the page. Sometimes I lie awake at night and remember the girl I was before Samuel died. She laughed more easily, trusted more readily, believed that love could conquer any hardship. I wonder what happened to her. Did she die with Samuel, or is she buried somewhere inside me, waiting for someone brave enough to resurrect her? Amelia? Amelia? Margaret's voice came from the kitchen, sharp with concern. Where did you go? Panic flooded through Amelia as she heard her mother's footsteps approaching the bedroom. She tried to close the diary, but her hands were shaking, and in her haste, she dropped it. The book hit the floor with a soft thud, pages fluttering. Margaret appeared in the doorway just as Amelia scrambled to gather the scattered pages. For a moment, neither woman moved. Margaret's face went through a series of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, anger, and finally something that looked like resignation. "I'm sorry," Amelia whispered, clutching the diary against her chest. "I found it by accident when the floorboard came loose. I shouldn't have read it." Margaret stepped into the room, her movements careful and controlled. "But you did read it." "Only a little. Just enough to see," Amelia's voice broke. "Mama, I had no idea you felt that way." "What way?" "Guilty. Afraid. Like you might be failing me somehow." Amelia held out the diary with trembling hands. "I thought you were completely certain about everything, completely confident in all your decisions." Margaret took the diary but didn't immediately put it away. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed, running her fingers over the worn leather cover. "I've never been certain about anything, not since your father died. Maybe not even before then." Amelia sat beside her mother, close enough to see the fine lines around her eyes, the grey threading through her brown hair. "The entry I read. You wrote about feeling like your love had become my prison." Margaret winced. "You weren't supposed to see that. But it's true, isn't it? At least partly true." Amelia took a shaky breath. "Just like it's partly true that I've felt trapped here, even though I love you and I love this place." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truths settling between them. From the kitchen came the sound of Daniel moving around, quietly giving them space for this unexpected confrontation. "There's more," Margaret said quietly. "Things I've written about you, about myself, about the choices I've made, things I was too afraid to say out loud. Will you tell me now? Not everything at once, but some of it?" Margaret opened the diary to a random page, her eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. "I wrote this last Christmas, when you asked if we could visit the Hendersons for their holiday celebration." She cleared her throat and began to read. "Amelia wanted to accept the Hendersons' invitation today, and I said no without really thinking about why. Later, I realized I was afraid, not of the weather or the long ride, but of seeing her with other people. What if she's more herself around them than she is around me? What if I discover that my company isn't enough for her happiness? What if she realizes there are other ways to live, other kinds of families who laugh more and worry less? Amelia felt tears sting her eyes. "Oh, Mama, I do love being with you, but I also want to know other people, experience other things. Not because you're not enough, but because I want to bring more of myself back to share with you." Margaret looked up from the diary. "I never thought of it that way, and I never understood how much you worried about doing right by me. I thought your rules came from not trusting me, but they came from not trusting yourself." Daniel's voice drifted from the kitchen, humming a tune neither of them recognized, but that somehow sounded like peace. His presence in their home had already changed so much, not by forcing them to confront their problems, but by creating a safe space where honesty felt possible. "There's something else," Margaret said, flipping to a more recent entry. "Something I wrote after Daniel arrived." She found the page she was looking for and read aloud. "There's a stranger in our home tonight, and for the first time in years, I feel like I'm seeing myself through someone else's eyes. Not just as Amelia's mother or Samuel's widow, but as Margaret. I'd almost forgotten that person existed." Amelia reached for her mother's hand. "She never stopped existing. She just got buried under all the responsibilities and fears. But I can see her now, especially when you talk about Papa or when you watch Daniel carve his horses. Do you really think we could be different? Not completely different, but more ourselves? I think we're already starting to be different. This conversation would have been impossible a week ago." Margaret closed the diary and held it against her chest. "I'm scared, Amelia. Scared of changing too much. Scared of not changing enough. Scared of making the wrong choice about Eleanor's invitation." "Then maybe we don't have to choose right away. Maybe we can take time to figure out who we really are before we decide where we want to be." From the kitchen came the sound of Daniel starting to prepare lunch. The familiar rhythm of chopping and stirring that had become part of their daily soundtrack. Both women found themselves smiling at the domestic normality of it. "He's been good for us," Margaret said softly. "He's helped us be good for each other," Amelia corrected. The rest was already there, waiting. Margaret rewrapped the diary in its oiled cloth, but instead of returning it to the hiding place under the floorboard, she set it on her bedside table. Some secrets they were both learning lost their power when brought into the light. Daniel's deputy marshal badge lay wrapped in a piece of black cloth at the bottom of his saddlebags, beneath spare clothes and ammunition. The five-pointed star bore the inscription, U. Deputy Marshal, Montana Territory, and carried with it the authority to pursue criminals across state lines, to make arrests without local warrants, and to use deadly force when necessary. For 3 months, Daniel Hartwell had been tracking the Cassidy gang, 4 ruthless men who specialized in robbing isolated homesteads during harsh winter months, when help was days away and victims were trapped by weather. The knock on the cabin door came just after dawn on Daniel's 5th day, with the Whitmore women. All 3 had been lingering over coffee, reluctant to break the peaceful atmosphere that had settled over their small household. Margaret was reading aloud from one of Samuel's old books while Amelia worked on mending a torn apron. Daniel sat near the window, whittling another small figure, this time a bird with outstretched wings. The knocking was different from Daniel's polite announcement days earlier. This was harsh, demanding, the sound of men who expected doors to be opened without question. Daniel's hands stilled on his carving, and Margaret noticed the immediate change in his posture. He was no longer the gentle stranger who'd shared their meals and helped with chores. Every line of his body spoke of coiled readiness, of a man prepared for violence. "Ladies," he said quietly, setting down his knife and standing in one fluid motion, "I need you both to step away from the windows and stay calm." Amelia started to ask what was wrong, but Daniel held up a hand for silence. He moved to his saddlebags with purposeful efficiency, extracting not just the marshal's badge, but a well-maintained Colt revolver and a rifle that had clearly seen professional use. Margaret's breath caught as she saw the weapons. "Daniel, what—" "U.S. Marshal Daniel Hartwell," he said quietly, pinning the badge to his shirt. "I've been tracking 4 dangerous men for the past 3 months. I believe they've just found us." The knocking came again, more insistent. A rough voice called through the door. "Open up. We need shelter and supplies." Daniel checked his weapons with the practiced movements of someone who'd done this many times before. "The Cassidy gang," he explained in a whisper. "They rob isolated homesteads, often killing anyone who might identify them later. They've been moving through this area for weeks." Amelia felt the blood drain from her face. "How do you know it's them?" "Because Jake Cassidy has a distinctive voice, and I've been listening to it for 3 months. Daniel moved toward the door, but not to open it. Instead, he positioned himself where he could see outside through a crack in the shutters. 4 men, heavily armed. Their horses look hard-ridden. Margaret's mind raced. "Why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you warn us you were bringing danger to our home?" Daniel's face was grim. "Because I hoped I'd lost their trail weeks ago. Because I thought this was the safest place for all of us." He looked at both women, his expression heavy with responsibility. "I'm sorry. I never intended to put you in harm's way." The voice outside grew more threatening. "We know someone's in there. We saw smoke from the chimney." "What do they want?" Amelia whispered. "Food, ammunition, warm shelter. They'll take whatever they find useful and eliminate anyone who might report their presence." Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact, but his eyes held steel. "They've killed at least 6 people in similar situations." Margaret felt a strange calm settle over her, the same clarity that had carried her through Samuel's death and 15 years of frontier challenges. "What do you need us to do?" Daniel looked surprised by her steady tone. "Can you both handle firearms?" "We're frontier women," Amelia said with more confidence than she felt. "We know how to defend ourselves." "Good. Margaret, is there a back way out of this cabin?" "The root cellar has an exit that comes up behind the barn. Samuel built it in case of Indian raids." "Perfect. Here's what we're going to do." Daniel spoke quickly but clearly. "I'm going to answer the door, try to convince them I'm just a traveler like they are. While I keep them talking, you 2 slip out through the cellar and get to the barn. There are enough hiding places there to keep you safe." "What about you?" Margaret asked. "I'll handle them." 4 against 1? Amelia shook her head. "Those aren't good odds." Daniel smiled grimly. "I've faced worse odds and better men." He checked his weapons one final time. "These men killed a family near Billings last month, parents and 2 children. They don't deserve mercy, and they won't show any." The hammering on the door resumed, accompanied by increasingly violent threats. "Open this door now, or we'll break it down." Margaret grabbed Daniel's arm. "There's another way. Samuel always said this cabin was built like a fortress for a reason. We know every inch of this place, every strength and weakness. They don't. What are you suggesting? We fight together, all 3 of us." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "This is our home, our ground. We make them come to us on our terms." Daniel studied her face, then looked at Amelia. Both women stood straighter, their fear transformed into determination. He recognized the look he'd seen it on the faces of settlers who'd decided to make their stand rather than run. "Jake Cassidy," Daniel called through the door, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "U.S. Marshal Daniel Hartwell. You're surrounded and under arrest." A moment of silence followed, then explosive cursing from outside. "Hartwell, we should have known." The voice turned, calculating. "You got anyone in there with you, Marshal?" "Just me and my conscience," Daniel replied. "Though my conscience is telling me you boys have been very naughty." Margaret almost smiled despite the danger. Even facing death, Daniel maintained his gentle humor. "Tell you what, Hartwell," Cassidy called back. "You come out with your hands up, and we'll make it quick. Stay in there, and we'll burn you out." Either way, you're done tracking us. Counter-offer, Daniel replied. You surrender now, and I'll make sure you live to see trial. Keep this up, and I'll make sure you don't see another sunrise. The response was a gunshot that splintered wood near the doorframe. The siege had begun. Daniel turned to the women, his face serious but not afraid. Last chance to run. Margaret picked up Samuel's old rifle from above the fireplace. This is our home. These men threatened our family. She looked at Amelia, then back at Daniel. And like it or not, Marshal Hartwell, you're part of our family now. Amelia moved to the window with her father's pistol, checking the cylinder with steady hands. Besides, someone needs to watch your back. You've been taking care of us for days. Time we returned the favor. Daniel felt something unexpected, not just professional respect for their courage, but genuine affection for these remarkable women who'd chosen to stand and fight rather than flee. He'd started this assignment thinking only of justice for the families the Cassidy gang had destroyed. But now, looking at Margaret and Amelia preparing to defend their home, he understood he was fighting for something much more personal. Outside, the gang was positioning themselves around the cabin, testing doors and windows. Inside, 3 people who'd barely known each other a week ago prepared to risk their lives for each other. The real battle was about to begin. Margaret's father's shotgun had been mounted above the kitchen door for 15 years, a symbol of protection and frontier pragmatism that she'd hoped never to use against another human being. The weapon had belonged to her father back in Pennsylvania, had crossed the plains with her and Samuel, and had taken countless game birds to feed their family through lean times. Now, as she lifted it down with steady hands, Margaret felt the weight of 3 generations of survival resting in her grip. The gun hasn't been fired in months, she told Daniel as she broke it open to check the shells. But I cleaned it last fall, and the ammunition is fresh. Daniel nodded approvingly. Your father taught you well. What about defensive positions? How well do you know the Consig? Sightlines around this cabin? Amelia moved to the eastern window, peering carefully through a gap in the shutters. 2 men positioning themselves behind the woodpile. They have a clear view of the front door and this window. She shifted to get a better angle. The one with the black hat is carrying a rifle. The other has twin pistols. That's Cassidy and his brother Tom, Daniel confirmed. The other 2 will be circling around back. Bill Hawkins is missing 2 fingers on his left hand, easy to identify. Pete Morrison has a scar running from his ear to his jaw. He checked his own rifle, ensuring a round was chambered. They're smart fighters, but predictable. They'll try to flush us out with fire. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Fire? Burning arrows, probably aimed at the roof. They'll want to force us outside where they can pick us off. Daniel studied the cabin's layout with new eyes, seeing it as a battlefield rather than a home. What's the roof made of? Thick split logs with a layer of sod, Amelia answered. Papa said it would turn aside most anything short of a lightning strike. Good, that gives us time. Daniel moved to the back window, keeping low. I see movement by the barn. 2 figures, just like I expected. He turned back to the women. Here's what they'll do. Create a distraction at the front, while the other 2 try to breach the back door or a window. Standard tactics for men who've done this before. Margaret's grip tightened on the shotgun. The weight of it felt familiar and foreign at the same time, a tool of protection she'd always hoped to use only for hunting. How do we stop them? We make them fight our fight instead of theirs. They're expecting us to panic, to make mistakes, to react instead of act. Daniel's voice carried the calm authority of a man who'd survived similar situations. But this is your ground. You know every inch of it. That's our advantage. Amelia had been thinking while listening to their tactical discussion. The root cellar, it connects to the barn through an underground passage. If we could get someone behind them, too dangerous. Daniel cut her off. I won't have either of you exposed outside these walls. But you just said we need to act instead of react, Margaret pointed out. What if one of us could get to the barn and create a crossfire? They wouldn't expect that from frontier women. Daniel looked at both women with growing respect and worry in equal measure. You're talking about combat, not hunting or target practice. These men kill without hesitation. So did the wolves that came after our chickens last winter, Amelia said quietly. So did the rattlesnake I found in the garden. When something threatens your family, you do what's necessary. A shot rang out from the front of the cabin, splintering wood near the doorframe. It was followed by Cassidy's voice. "Hartwell, we're done talking. Come out now or we start shooting to kill." Daniel positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready. "Margaret, take the back window. Amelia, you watch the sides. Don't shoot unless you have a clear target and you're certain of your aim. These men are experienced killers, but they've never faced a united family defending their home." Margaret moved to her position, the shotgun feeling more natural in her hands with each passing moment. Through the window, she could see the two men Daniel had described approaching the back of the cabin with careful, predatory movements. The one with missing fingers carried a torch alongside his gun. "They're going to try to burn us out," she called softly to the others. "Let them try," Daniel replied. "The moment they get close enough to throw that torch, you take the shot. A shotgun at close range will stop any man, no matter how determined." Amelia watched from the side window as shadows moved between the trees. "How long have you been tracking them?" 3 months, since they hit the Patterson homestead near Helena. Daniel's voice carried old pain. "Family of 5. The youngest was just 4 years old." He paused, then continued more quietly. "I was a day behind them then, always a day behind. Until now." Margaret understood the weight he'd been carrying. "This isn't just about justice anymore, is it?" "No," Daniel admitted. "It's about stopping them before they destroy another family. Before another marshal has to ride up to a burned cabin and count bodies." A flaming arrow struck the roof above them, followed immediately by 2 more. The thick logs and sod construction held, but Margaret could hear the fire beginning to catch on the outer layer. "They're testing our defenses," Daniel observed, "seeing how quickly the roof will catch. When they realize it won't burn fast enough, they'll rush us." Amelia felt her heart racing, but forced herself to breathe steadily. "What's the signal? How do we coordinate?" "Stay calm, aim true, and trust each other," Daniel replied. "When shooting starts, it's going to happen fast. Don't hesitate, don't second guess, and don't try to wound them. These men don't offer quarter, and they don't deserve it." Margaret thought about the diary hidden under her bed, about all the fears and hopes she'd written in its pages. Tomorrow, if they survived, she would write about this day, about the moment she'd chosen to fight alongside a man she'd known for less than a week, about standing with her daughter against men who would destroy everything they'd built. "Amelia," she called softly, "whatever happens today, I want you to know I'm proud of the woman you've become. Your father would be proud too, Mama. And I want you to know that after this is over, we're going to have different conversations. About choices, about the future, about what it means to be a family." Margaret's voice grew stronger. "Whether we stay here or go to Boston, we're going to do it together, and we're going to do it with honesty." Daniel smiled, despite the danger surrounding them. "Sarah always said that the moments before a fight show you who people really are. She would have liked you both very much." Another flaming arrow hit the roof, this one followed by the sound of men moving more aggressively outside. The fire above them was spreading, though slowly. Soon, the outlaws would realize their burning strategy wasn't working fast enough. "They're getting impatient," Daniel observed. "Cassidy's not a man who likes prolonged engagements. He'll order a direct assault soon." Margaret checked her shotgun one more time, ensuring both barrels were loaded. "Then we'll be ready for him." Amelia moved to a better position by her window, her father's pistol steady in her grip. "Daniel, when this is over, will you stay with us for a while? I mean, really stay, not just until the weather clears." Daniel looked at both women, Margaret, with her determined stance and protective weapon. Amelia, with her courage shining despite her fear, and felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. The sense of belonging somewhere, of having people worth fighting for beyond duty and justice. "If you'll have me," he said quietly, "I'd like that very much." Outside, Jake Cassidy's voice rose in a shout. "Burn them out!" All sides at once. The final assault was beginning. Amelia's sewing scissors had been her grandmother's, small, sharp, and deceptively delicate. She'd carried them in her apron pocket for years, using them for everything from cutting thread to trimming herbs from the garden. Now, as gunfire erupted around the cabin and the smell of smoke filled the air, those familiar scissors became something else entirely. A weapon of last resort, held ready in her left hand, while her right gripped her father's pistol. The assault began with a coordinated rush from all four sides of the cabin. Jake Cassidy's war cry split the morning air as he and his brother charged the front door, their rifles blazing. Simultaneously, Bill Hawkins hurled his torch at the back wall, while Pete Morrison smashed through the shutters of the eastern window with the butt of his gun. Daniel's first shot took Tom Cassidy in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle flying into the snow. The marshal's second shot missed Jake by inches as the outlaw leader dove behind the chopping block near the front porch. Margaret's shotgun boomed from the back window, the blast catching Bill Hawkins' center mass as he tried to follow his torch through the broken frame. The man crumpled immediately, his dying scream cut short by the devastating impact of buckshot at close range. "One down," Margaret called, breaking open the shotgun to reload with practiced efficiency. Amelia found herself face to face with Pete Morrison as he came through the eastern window in a shower of broken wood and glass. The scarred outlaw's eyes widened in surprise when he saw a young woman instead of the lawman he'd expected, but his gun was already rising toward her chest. Time seemed to slow as Amelia made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Instead of trying to bring up her pistol too slow, she realized with crystal clarity. She lunged forward with the scissors, driving the sharp points deep into Morrison's gun hand. Morrison's scream of pain and rage filled the cabin as his weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling. Blood spurted from the wounds between his fingers, and his pistol clattered to the floor. Amelia stepped back, raising her father's gun with both hands now, and put 2 shots into the wounded outlaw's chest. Morrison fell backward through the broken window, his body crashing into the snow outside with a wet thud. "Amelia!" Margaret's voice cracked with worry and pride in equal measure. "I'm all right," Amelia called back, though her hands were shaking as she looked down at the bloody scissors still clutched in her left palm. She'd never killed anything larger than a chicken before, but the memory of Morrison's eyes, cold, calculating, and utterly without mercy, steadied her resolve. Daniel had taken cover behind the heavy kitchen table, trading shots with Jake Cassidy through the splintered front door. The outlaw leader was pinned behind the chopping block, but still dangerous, his rifle sending splinters flying with each shot. "Cassidy!" Daniel shouted during a lull in the firing. "Your brother's down, Hawkins is dead, and Morrison just went through a window. It's over. Like hell it's over." Cassidy's reply came with another rifle shot that punched through the door frame, inches from Daniel's head. "I'll burn this whole place down with you in it." Tom Cassidy, wounded but not dead, had crawled behind the water trough and was trying to reach his fallen rifle with his good arm. Margaret spotted him through a gap in the front shutters and adjusted her aim. Her second shotgun blast caught Tom Cassidy as his fingers closed around his weapon. The younger Cassidy brother rolled onto his back in the snow, staring sightlessly at the grey winter sky. "2 down," Margaret announced, reloading again. Jake Cassidy's rage exploded in a string of curses that would have made a saloon drunk blush. He began firing wildly at the cabin, his shots less precise now but more desperate. A bullet shattered the coffee pot on the stove, another punched through Margaret's cherished photograph on the mantelpiece. Daniel saw his opportunity. While Cassidy was focused on his fury rather than his tactics, the marshal rose from behind the table and put a clean shot through the chopping block. The heavy bullet punched through the wood and found its target. Jake Cassidy's rifle fell silent. Daniel waited a full minute, listening carefully, before moving toward the front door. The sudden quiet felt almost unnatural after the explosive violence of the past few minutes. "Is it over?" Amelia asked, still, holding her pistol ready. "I think so," Daniel replied. But he kept his weapon trained on the front yard as he peered through the broken door. "Jake's not moving, and the others are definitely dead." Margaret lowered her shotgun, her arm suddenly feeling the weight of the heavy weapon. 4 men. We killed 4 men." Daniel looked back at both women, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. Margaret stood straight despite her obvious exhaustion, her grey hair escaping its pins, but her eyes fierce and determined. Amelia clutched the bloody scissors that had saved her life, no longer the sheltered frontier girl, but a woman who'd faced death and emerged victorious. They were still family, but they were something more now too. They were survivors who'd chosen to fight together rather than flee separately. The cabin around them bore the scars of battle, but the bonds between them had never been stronger. The kitchen water bucket sat beside the stove where it always had, still half filled from the morning's routine. The same bucket that had started their journey together when Amelia dumped its contents over her mother's head in a moment of frustrated rebellion. Now, as smoke from the torch-lit back wall began to thicken inside the cabin, that ordinary bucket would serve a purpose none of them could have imagined. Daniel stepped carefully onto the front porch, his rifle trained on Jake Cassidy's motionless form behind the chopping block. The outlaw leader lay sprawled in the snow, a dark stain spreading beneath him. But 15 years of law enforcement had taught Daniel never to trust that a dangerous man was truly finished. "Jake Cassidy," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "If you can hear me, show your hands." No response came from the still figure. Daniel approached cautiously, keeping his weapon ready, while Margaret and Amelia watched from the cabin's broken doorway. That's when they heard it, a low groan from behind the water trough where Tom Cassidy had fallen. The younger brother wasn't dead after all. Margaret's shotgun blast had wounded him severely, but he was still breathing, still dangerous. "Daniel," Margaret called urgently, "Tom's alive." Daniel spun toward the sound, but Tom Cassidy was already moving. Despite his wounds, the outlaw had managed to pull a hidden derringer from his boot. His face was pale with blood loss, but his eyes burned with hatred as he raised the small pistol toward Daniel's back. "Look out!" Amelia screamed. The warning came just in time. Daniel threw himself sideways as the derringer barked, its bullet whining past his ear. He hit the snow hard, his rifle flying from his hands as he rolled behind a pile of firewood. Tom Cassidy tried to stand, failed, and settled for propping himself against the water trough. Blood ran freely from his shoulder and chest, but his gun hand remained steady. "Should have minded your own business, Marshal," he gasped. "Should have let us ride on." Daniel was pinned behind the woodpile with no clear shot. His rifle lay in the open snow, too far to reach without exposing himself to Tom's derringer. The wounded outlaw might only have 1 shot left in the small gun, but at this range, 1 shot would be enough. Inside the cabin, Margaret raised her shotgun, but the angle was wrong. Tom was using the water trough as cover, and she couldn't get a clear line of sight without stepping outside, which would expose her to his gun. That's when Amelia noticed the smoke getting thicker. The torch Bill Hawkins had thrown was doing its work on the cabin's back wall. The fire was spreading faster than they'd expected, and soon their shelter would become a death trap. "The wall's catching fire," she told her mother urgently. "We have maybe 5 minutes before the whole back section goes up." Margaret looked at the water bucket, then at Tom Cassidy's position, then at Daniel trapped behind the woodpile. An idea began to form, dangerous, probably foolish, but their only chance. "Amelia, can you get a clear shot at Tom from the side window?" Amelia moved to check. "Maybe, but I'd have to expose myself, and he'd see me coming. Not if he's distracted." Margaret grabbed the water bucket, feeling its familiar weight. I'm going to draw his attention. When he turns to shoot at me, you take him down. Mama, no, that's suicide. Margaret smiled, and for the first time in years, Amelia saw the young woman who'd married Samuel Whitmore and followed him into the wilderness. No, dear, that's family. Before Amelia could stop her, Margaret burst through the front door. Tom Cassidy, she shouted, raising the bucket high above her head. Remember this? Tom swung his derringer toward this new threat, confused by the strange weapon, but recognizing the danger of letting anyone get close. His finger tightened on the trigger, just as Margaret hurled the bucket's contents directly at his face. The cold water struck Tom like a physical blow, shocking him and temporarily blinding him. His shot went wide, the bullet shattering harmlessly against the cabin's log wall. In that instant, Amelia appeared at the side window, her father's pistol steady in both hands. She took careful aim and fired once, twice, 3 times. Tom Cassidy jerked with each impact, his derringer falling from nerveless fingers. This time, he didn't move again. Daniel recovered his rifle and quickly checked both Cassidy brothers. They're finished, he announced. All 4 of them. Margaret stood in the snow beside the empty bucket, water dripping from her hands, smoke rising from the cabin behind her. The same bucket that had once been a weapon of anger had become an instrument of salvation. Amelia ran to her mother, throwing her arms around her in a fierce embrace. That was the bravest, most foolish thing I've ever seen, she whispered. I learned from the best, Margaret replied, holding her daughter close. Your father always said that protecting your family isn't about being fearless. It's about being more afraid of losing them than you are of dying. Daniel approached them both, his badge catching the morning light. It's over. The Cassidy gang won't hurt anyone else. The 3 of them stood together in the snow, surrounded by the aftermath of violence, but united by something stronger than fear or duty. They had become what families are supposed to be, people willing to risk everything for each other, people who understand that some things are worth fighting for, people who know that love sometimes requires the courage to act when action seems impossible. Behind them, the cabin's fire was already dying down, contained by the solid construction Samuel Whitmore had built to last. Like his family, it had survived the storm. The new family portrait would show 3 figures standing together on the cabin's front porch, their faces bearing the quiet confidence of people who had survived something terrible and emerged stronger for it. Daniel had produced a small camera from his saddlebags, another tool of his trade as a marshal, used for documenting crime scenes and identifying criminals, but today it would serve a different purpose entirely. For the first time in their lives, Margaret and Amelia would have a photograph taken not out of formal obligation, but as a celebration of who they had become. 2 weeks had passed since the battle with the Cassidy gang. The bullet holes in the cabin walls had been repaired, the broken windows replaced with new glass ordered from Helena, and the scorch marks from Bill Hawkins's torch sanded away and restained. But the real healing had nothing to do with carpentry and everything to do with the conversations that filled their evenings now. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's letter spread before her alongside her own half-finished reply. The words came easier now, after all they'd shared with each other and with Daniel. She no longer felt the need to pretend strength she didn't possess or hide vulnerabilities that made her human. Dearest Eleanor, she wrote, I received your kind invitation and have given it serious consideration. Amelia and I have much to discuss about our future, but I wanted you to know that whatever we decide, it will be a choice made together, not out of fear or desperation. We have learned recently that we are stronger than we knew, both individually and as a family. Daniel sat by the fireplace, working on a new carving, not a lonely horse this time, but a pair of figures standing side by side. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision, but his attention was divided between his craft and the domestic scene unfolding around him. The territorial judge wants to commend all 3 of us, he announced, pausing in his work. Seems word has spread about what happened here. A family standing together against the Cassidy gang has caught people's attention. Amelia looked up from the music box she was trying to repair, following Daniel's patient instructions. Will there be a ceremony? If we want one, but honestly, I think we've had enough excitement for a while. Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. I told the judge that the real heroes were two women who chose courage over safety, family over self-preservation. Margaret set down her pen, considering her words carefully. Daniel, we need to talk about what happens next, for all of us. The question had been hanging unspoken between them for days. Daniel's job tracking the Cassidy gang was finished. His official duties could take him anywhere in the territory, or beyond. The women had choices to make about Eleanor's invitation, about their future, about what kind of life they wanted to build. I've been thinking about that, Daniel said quietly. The Territorial Marshal Service has offered me a position based out of Helena. Less traveling, more administrative work. Training new deputies, coordinating with local sheriffs. He looked directly at both women. It would mean I could stay in Montana if I wanted to. Do you want to? Amelia asked, her voice carefully neutral. Daniel set down his carving and really looked at them, Margaret with her graying hair and strong hands, Amelia with her bright eyes and newfound confidence. The cabin around them bore small reminders of their shared ordeal and their growing bond. The repaired walls, the rescued music box, the wooden horses he'd carved sitting on the mantelpiece beside the cracked photograph of Samuel and young Margaret. I've been alone for 3 years, he said simply, moving from town to town, case to case, never staying anywhere long enough to call it home. I'd forgotten what it felt like to belong somewhere, to have people who cared whether I came back at the end of the day. He paused, gathering courage for words that had taken him weeks to find. If you'll have me, I'd like to make this my home base, not as a temporary guest, but as family. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. What about Eleanor's invitation? What if we decide to go east? Then I suppose I'll have to learn about city life, Daniel replied with a gentle smile. Though I suspect I'd be more useful teaching you about Helena than trying to navigate Boston society. Amelia had been listening while working on the music box mechanism, and suddenly a small, perfect chime sounded from the delicate instrument. The melody that had been silent for years filled the cabin with its sweet waltz, just as it had when she was a child, and her father wound the key with patient hands. It's fixed, she whispered, wonder in her voice. Some things just need the right touch, Daniel said, echoing his words from weeks earlier. And sometimes they need to be broken before they can be properly repaired. Margaret stood and moved to her daughter's side, watching the tiny ballerina spin to music that had been trapped for so long. Your father always said every little girl should have music in her life. He was right, Amelia said softly. But I think he would have added that every woman should have choices in her life, and every family should have room for new members who bring their own gifts to share. Margaret picked up her pen and returned to Eleanor's letter. Dearest sister, she continued, I must tell you about a remarkable man who came into our lives during a terrible storm. His name is Daniel Hartwell, and he has taught us that strength shared is not strength diminished, but strength multiplied. Whether we come to Boston or remain in Montana, we will not be the same women who received your kind invitation. We have learned to be honest with each other, to trust each other's judgment, and to stand together when facing difficulties. As she wrote, the music box played its gentle waltz. Daniel carved his figures of companionship, and Amelia planned improvements to their cabin that would accommodate their expanded family. Outside, snow began to fall again, but none of them minded. They had learned that storms, like difficulties, were easier to weather when faced together. The photograph Daniel would take the next morning would capture more than their faces. It would preserve the moment when three people who had found each other during the darkest of times chose to build a future filled with light, music, and the kind of love that grows stronger under pressure. Sometimes the best families are not born but forged, not inherited but chosen, not perfect but perfectly willing to fight for each other when the storms of life threaten to tear them apart.